Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 30. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host today. I'm joined here by Christopher Sowski and Mr. Teld on the line. From what I can tell, Chris had a nice, relaxing weekend. I am feeling super sick, and Teld is currently playing Morrowind in the background. So we're all here with the best energy we can muster to bring you some good Magic the Gathering content. But I'll let you guys speak for yourselves. How are you doing today?
Just hollow inside. Actually, no, the thing that's bothering me right now is I feel like a huge dipshit. I had hernia surgery like 3 weeks ago, and I was told to, take it really easy for like 5 weeks. Don't lift anything heavy, don't walk your dog, whatever. And that's all fine. And then last weekend, I went out to an event that a friend invited me to, and I was like, okay, man, we're gonna go, but you got to take it easy, whatever. But then I ended up having like a good time, and I danced some, like not a ton. I didn't think that I overdid it. I hadn't had any pain in the operation site for like 10 consecutive days. I literally was not like you wouldn't have been able to tell that I'd had surgery, so I didn't think like spinning around like a dipshit for like half an hour would have been a problem. And now my shit aches and is probably fucked, and I'm gonna try to get a doctor to tell me like just how many of my own stitches I ripped out. So we might not even want to include that in the edit, honestly, Tim. I just needed to complain about it for a second.
Okay, well, I mean, no, that's good content. That's good Magic Gathering content. We'll get that in there. Teld, you doing all right over there? It sounded like maybe none of us are having that good of a time right now.
Yeah, it's been rough. I've just been in a bit of a funk. I'm just needing to work my way out of it. I'll go hit the gym, lift some more weights, play through some good video games. Catching up
those PRs at the gym.
Yeah, catching up at work would probably also help. Like it's been a really stressful time this beginning of the school year. So
yeah, my kiddo's sick as well, which means I'm sick as well. So we've all got our things going on.
We're a ragtag gang right now.
Mm-hmm. We get to spend a good hour and a half here talking about Magic the Gathering and ignoring our problems, though. So that's nice. I will say episode 30, a little bit of a secret mile marker. Chris and I used to do an old podcast called The Deep Dive, which, by the way, I thought was like a super clever name at the time, and then realized that everybody calls everything a deep dive.
Yeah.
But we got to episode 30 of that before we called it quits. I think our last episode of the deep dive was a deep dive on Rakdos in Cube, and that was the last episode we put out. So we have officially caught up to the deep dive on the Jank Tank, and
oh, really?
Hopefully, unless this is somehow the last episode, we'll surpass it. So a little bit of a congratulatory mile marker for us. And I'll say it's been better to have Teld with us as well, just a third opinion bouncing around. So
well, here's the sad thing, like that was a better show, right? But then we changed something. I'm trying to remember what we changed. I feel like we brought in a new person.
There's a different energy now for sure. I don't know. All I'm saying is we had Theo guest star on the deep dive, and I've never had Theo on. Wait, that's actually not true. I did a bonus episode with Theo.
Mm-hmm. The funny thing was the deep dive. We were not the only, like if you typed in the deep dive podcast in Spotify, we weren't the only podcast on Spotify called the deep dive. I can't even remember what the other like 2 or 3 of them were about, but there were like we had siblings.
When you type in the deep dive, there you will get like 500 podcasts.
Yeah, it was so we're Jank Diver gaming divers, like you're going for a dive. Like I was like, oh, I'm so fucking clever, like the deep dive. And then I think like maybe we did our first episode or something, and then I was like perusing Channel Fireball's articles at the time when I used to do that, and like Reed Duke was like, here's our deep dive on blah blah blah, and I was like, oh wait, deep dive is just like a thing people say, and no one will ever associate it with this podcast, but whatever, it worked, it was fine.
But here's the thing, Tim, we were the deep dive, we were the definitive deep dive.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm pretty sure I used like copyrighted music as like the intro and outro and stuff.
You did,
like I don't know, there was some questionable stuff going on.
So now that we're at 30 episodes, are we gonna like have to change our name, be like the podcast formerly known as the Jank Tank, or the podcast formerly known as the Deep Dive?
But people have asked multiple times where the name the Jank Tank came from, or not the Jank Tank necessarily, but Jank Diver Gaming, and that's an interesting story for another time. But the Jank Tank is just It just sounded quirky. I don't remember. Do you guys remember what the alternatives we threw around were for this podcast?
I don't.
We had a couple other ones that I can't quite recall, but we landed on the Jank Tank.
I do remember my original pitch for the Jank Diver gaming community name, and I'm glad that I lost. Mine was Mono Fun Aggro.
Oh God.
Yeah, not good.
Good thing we didn't know.
That does not sound like a 1,000 person Discord name, Chris.
No.
Yeah, mono. Yeah, we're gonna go draft with Mono Fun Aggro. You know that. I don't like that one.
No. Well, we didn't land on that, obviously. So.
No. Some of the alternatives I remember, the Waterfall Cube was pitched as a name for the community. I don't remember what the purpose of that was, but it was just the Waterfall Cube. I remember pitching the name Filthy Peasants, which was a good one, but at the time we only did peasant stuff, and I think we recognized like, oh, maybe in the future we'll do non-peasant stuff and the name won't stick quite as well. So
right.
I did like that. I also like the idea of Alpha Strike, which makes us sound like way edgier than we are.
Oh yeah,
that sounds like super spiky.
Yeah, I have no regrets. I think we landed with something very nice.
Yeah, Jank Diver Game is a good one.
There was like a YouTube channel, I think, that had like 2 videos that was like the Jank Diver.
Yeah, you're right.
And they commented on the videos like, hello fellow Jank Diver, and I was like, somebody call the lawyers, okay? Like somebody call the lawyers. Let's get
about that.
Somebody call the lawyers. This is a not so subtle warning. Like I was here first. And then I was gonna be like, yeah, but we're gonna be here last, bro. Don't.
Yeah. How you doing now, Jank Diver? Let's get into that's a little bit of Jank Diver Gaming history for you. Let's get into the episode here. Yeah, some backlogging. We are going to be talking about emergent decks today. We're going to be keeping it conversational. After like the 6 hours of set review stuff that we end up doing now for each new set every 2 or 3 weeks or whatever, I like to just do kind of a simple episode to follow that up with, because the editing process for the peasant review plus the normal review ends up being quite time consuming and wearing me out. We're going to keep it conversational here with an episode about emergent decks. We'll get into what that means, what they look like in our cube, and how maybe you could recognize that you have some emergent decks in your cube, because the whole crux of emergent decks is that they're kind of unexpected until you recognize that they're there. Before we do that, I want to go ahead and shout out the Jank Diver Gaming Discord. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, all things Magic. There's a lot of conversation surrounding Duskmorn Limited right now, which is kind of sweet. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We host tons of scheduled drafts throughout the week, including the Peasant Cube on Saturday nights, the mainline Jank Diver Cube on Sunday nights, F&M style drafts on Friday, where the players vote on a cube to play, and we've got various guest cubes created by members of our server throughout the week, so there's always plenty to do. You can check out our socials on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, and Twitch.tv/TeldTalks. If you are listening on YouTube, do me a favor, hit the like button, subscribe. And I will say, the road to 1,000 here, Teld mentioned having a 1,000 person server. He's selling us a little bit high there. We're actually at like 850-ish. I don't know the exact number, but my kind of secret goal of the year was to hit 1,000 by the end of the year. So hey, if you want to come join us in the Discord server, even if you want to just bolster that number to give me a little bit of an endorphin hit and make me feel good about myself, like, come join the Discord server, get us close to 1,000 by the end of this year. And if not, just a like on the YouTube video would be nice. So introductory stuff out of the way, we're going to move into our single card discussion, and we've actually got a little bit of a twofer for you today, because suggested by Roja a couple episodes back when we started doing the single card discussion. He mentioned that we should really try to link our single card discussion to the topic of the episode. So we've got a card that's going to be linked to what we're talking about today, but we've also got kind of like this new hotness or whatever you want to call it that came up in a draft recently that I think we should talk about because it really impressed everybody.
Spoiler alert, it has a Modern Horizons 3 symbol.
Yes, which maybe that's the only discussion we need, right? Like, does that just, if we just tell you a card has a Modern Horizons symbol on it, do we really need to explain anything about it anymore?
Probably not.
No, right. Let's start with that one, shall we?
Okay.
Since we're on the topic of Modern Horizons, I will say I've been a big advocate of this card, and I will say one of the hosts who was not on the original Deep Dive podcast, I'm not going to name any names, was not a fan of this card, but I believe Teld has seen the light on Arena of Glory now, and I'm going to let Chris talk about this card a little bit because it was you who was piloting the deck where this card really popped off last week. But Arena of Glory is the red land from Modern Horizons 3. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain. It taps for red mana, and as an alternate ability, you can pay red, tap it, and exert it to get double red mana. If that mana is spent on a creature spell, it gains haste until end of turn. So, Chris, what ended up happening with this card to the listener that makes us want to talk about it today?
So, just a quick read on the card. Basically, you can exert... You like exert the land, right, in order to give the thing haste. And on face value, it's pretty free in terms of like it potentially coming in tapped, unless like you're playing this in a deck where this is like your only red source in your opening hand or whatever. But like normally, I think you're just not going to find that's the case. This basically always comes in untapped, and it's like fine, I guess, in red aggressive decks. A lot of red aggressive decks are going to have a lot of hasty creatures anyway. But you know, it's obviously this is still like pretty much free to put in your deck, and you can haste out your Rekindling Phoenix or whatever. But when things get really fun is when you play like Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, which is a 4/4 flying lifelink that forces your opponent to discard, or if they can't, you draw, and if they discard a land, you make bats. I mean, it's just got a crazy attack trigger. Hasting that out, or what was even more fun, maybe not fun for my opponent, Persian, but yeah, I think we all know how good it is to like play Grave Titan and then attack with Grave Titan on the same turn. It's kind of hard to lose. So yeah, it's just one of the things that I saw the potential for was just like in like red-black rock or like green-red ramp, you know, like putting out your Prime Time or your Kogla or whatever, and then just giving that thing haste. It makes all your big, giant, scary things just bigger and gianter and scarier. And it really, really jacks up the power level of your more Baneslayer-y type cards because your opponent just doesn't have the turn to like untap and answer the thing that they must answer if they're tapped out or whatever. It just you're kind of just running away with the game at that point. So it's really strong.
I think one of the moments that really solidified this card for me was your match against Persian, I believe, who was on like Esper control or blue-white control or something. Mm-hmm. And you had a Rekindle and Phoenix on board, and they drew Jace the Mind Sculptor for turn, which normally would be like a fine answer to Rekindle and Phoenix. Like it just gets it off the board, and you know, you get to keep your Jace around, presumably for the next turn. They have to spend their turn recasting Phoenix, but with Arena of Glory on board, like that just wasn't a proposition that made any sense to do, right? Because you could just haste out Phoenix and attack. There were a lot of spots where I noticed that the Arena of Glory like was secretly doing way more than it did. Like it just shut off your opponent's avenue to actually do what they wanted to do. And then yeah, the Inferno Titans coming down with haste and the Grave Titans coming down with haste, I think was really strong. The moment that, you know, really made me believe this card was worth the cube slot, because we read it during the Modern Horizons 3 review and we were like, this looks pretty good, but we need to see it in action. The moment that really solidified it for me was when Persian was actually playing it in a red-green deck, and they ended up casting Hugs for like X equals 3 or something like that, and exiled 3 creatures. They were able to use Arena of Glory the next turn to haste out 2 creatures from exile off of Hugs trigger, because you can split up the red mana that this makes between 2 different spells and give both those creatures haste.
Yeah.
So he went like Goblin and Narcomancer from a hand, and then use Arena of Glory's mana to haste out Bone Crusher Giant and haste out Breaches from exile in the same turn and then just swing with those creatures and hugs. And it was like, wow, that came from a land. My opponent did that from a land. So that's pretty crazy.
Right.
Teld, I don't know what your opinion is on this now. I know you definitely think it's like stronger than you did before, but Teld doubted the Modern Horizons 3 symbol for a moment, and I don't know that we should be doing that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, up until this point, what we've been seeing is when people played this card, it was mostly being played in like red aggressive decks, where I have to admit, giving a random 2/2 haste that already had haste is not a particularly good proposition. And you oftentimes couldn't afford to exert it because you wanted to be spending all of your mana every turn. And so until a little later into the game, when you were out of cards, it was hard to actually do this. I think the card has secretly, in my mind, become a Jund card where you're trying to play it with these, or like a non-mono red card, maybe like a non-red aggressive card. Like Chris said, it does kind of just slot in free, and it's like good with breaches. And Rekindling Phoenix, it's fine with and stuff. But I think the card's real power is just it's really good at making these big creatures with attack triggers, or like, you know, more decks playing bigger, dumber creatures without haste, letting them get in. And so, yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense in the like Naya Jundi space. Like I could see it being really good with Overlord of the Mistmoors that we're running, right? Just like get that in, make like eight power worth of flyers. I don't see how you lose after that. So yeah, I think its power is a little more contextual than some of the other Modern Horizons cards that I think were just like you put in deck and it's the best card in your deck. Whereas I think this one, you do have to do a bit of deck building before I think the card is actually good. But having seen it a couple of times now where people got over that deck building hump, I think it's pretty good.
I will say this, Persian had a good control deck and I think did a fairly good job in game 2 or the second game, controlling for what I was doing, and I believe that he lost that game to this card. I mean, if you don't have the counterspell at the time to keep your opponent from landing and attacking with their Grave Titan on the same turn, I think I got him with Aclazotz with it once, and I think that had that been any other land, I don't think that I would have won that game. And what I'm trying to illustrate is I do think that in terms of how much it like amps up your deck's power, that increase in power is especially noticeable into controlling opponents, because now as the control player, it's a lot more punishing for you to try to pick your moment to tap out, because you know you might be thinking like, oh well, they'll land like Aclazotz or whatever, but then I'll just like exile it or removal next turn when I untap. And now it's like literally any scary, gigantic thing that accrues value when it swings, like you have to have counterspell magic up for it, or you could just die to it. So I will say that I think it's probably more punishing against control decks than anybody else. So if that's not a dynamic you're interested in for your design, I just want to be mindful of that.
Yeah, and by the time you're casting like 5 and 6 drops, the exert drawback of giving up your land next turn, right, really isn't that big of a deal, right? Because I'll just cast like a 3-drop or 4-drop that turn instead if I can't cast my 6-drop. So, like, yeah, the haste is great. And haste enablers are good. Like, giving creatures haste is a good effect. It's just the haste enablers you would normally have access to. Things like, I mean, think things like, what's that Gruul card? Rhythm of the Wild, Fires of Yavimaya, you know, Invigorated Hot Spring. Those just aren't worth the yeah, they're not worth the cube slot, right? Like even, I mean, Rabbit Battery might be like the best example of one that's playable, but that's not like an exceptional card. It's just a card that has some utility and then can give haste later on. But this is just so free to slot into your deck. So it just becomes a question of like, do I free up a red slot in my cube to play it if I have good attack triggers, or, you know, a big Rocky Jundi type deck? And I think it's well worth it. This card looked really good to me during spoiler season, and I think it looks excellent now. Though, yeah, maybe you are supposed to be reserving it for like the big attack triggers instead of trying to like haste out your 3-drops or whatever. So we'll see if that one continues to hold on. But I was just very impressed with it. Speaking of being impressed by cards, Bristly Bill Spine Sower is the card we're going to talk about that ties into today's themes. But did we talk?
I was gonna say biggest miss of OTJ.
Yeah, did we even talk about this card during the OTJ?
I think
review? I don't think we.
I think we did. I think where we landed was this is just going to be like less consistent Luminarch Aspirant, which isn't like a bad card, but also kind of like who cares. And I think we came back and looked at it for the first round of like fetch lands that they gave us. And it was like, okay, well, this is probably worth looking at again. There's some more +1/+1 counter stuff going on. And, like, I don't think we ever thought that the card, like, sucked. We were just like, okay, like, does green really just need, like, worse Luminarch Aspirant? And it's not worse Luminarch Aspirant. It's a different card, and it's really powerful.
I think we also, and I know I was guilty of this, of kind of assuming that 5 mana effect was closer to Ribbon Text.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Bristly Bills has a 5 mana trigger of 3 green, double the number of +1 counters on each creature you control. And yeah, when we were first putting it together, like, it feels like the kind of effect that's not going to come up super often, but it is like a big reason why the card is so scary.
Yeah, and so Bristly Bill is the 2-drop 2/2 with the landfall, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, or on target creature rather. And then Teld mentioned the activated ability that can double counters on everything, which by the time you get to the mana to actually be able to activate that, you have counters on things because of Bristly Bill. But this is probably, outside of like Mana Dork ramp into like 6 and 7 drops, as far like if you're talking about mid-rangey green decks, this is probably the most explosive of the 2 drops, right? And just to kind of highlight that, I had a match against Doug the last time I played where he went turn 1 Land of War Elves, turn 2 Bristly Bill off of the Land of War Elves, play land for turn. Like, Bristly Bill is now 3/3. Next turn, play fetch land, crack it. Bristly Bill's a 5/5. And I think that same turn he played another Mana Dork. So by turn 4, he was able to, threaten the +1/+1 counter dump and had like a 5/5 or 6/6 Bristly Bill already. And then later that game, he played Nissa, Who Shakes the World. And I don't know if you know this or not, but when Nissa turns something into a 3/3, it does it by putting 3 +1/+1 counters on those forests. So like,
I didn't even think about that.
Can double that as well. Yeah, so I died in very quick order. And you might argue I died to Land of War Elves there rather than Bristly Bill, but the fetch land thing, the fetch land dynamic is really, I think, what pushes Bristly Bill over the top. To the point where I've asked, like, is this card problematic? It feels like it's doing really strong things,
It's sort of, to me, in the vein of Rosie Cotton of a sort, where it's a card that is probably better than we should be running, but also it's really fun to play with, so I don't want to let it go yet. I think the Bristly Bill benefited a couple of major structural changes that happened. So, I mean, we've gotten a number of +1/+1 counter cards. Like, even we get more of them every set now. Additionally, since we got it, we got 6 extra fetch lands from Prismatic Vista, as well as the 5 other fetch lands that I don't believe we had pre-OTJ, because those came out right before Modern Horizons 3 did. And then additionally, I think our more proactive, like Naya or Bant space aggressive green decks they've been doing better. They've kind of come together. And the last couple of green decks that have done well haven't necessarily had that. But you can also just slot this in your green ramp deck, and it's kind of just like fine. And I actually got sold when I was playing a Gruul deck, and like, I can't remember the exact context, but my opponent was well ahead of me, and we were in kind of a board stall that I thought I was losing. And then we got to where I got to like 10 mana, and Bristly Bill doubled, and then doubled again. It was like, oh, never mind. I've just got a bunch of 15/15s.
Yeah, I think I tuned in. I was like, oh, let me see what the people are up to. And I tuned into a draft, and like the board state immediately was like Bristly Bill and Ornery Tumblewag, both with like 15 or 16 counters on it. I was like, oh, okay. Bristly Bill is doing its thing today, I see. And the reason we're bringing this up as the single card discussion is, Teld, you said something on an episode not too long ago. I don't remember the exact context, but you said Bristly Bill is the type of card that creates its own synergies. And it's because of cards like Bristly Bill, Luminarch Aspirant, Tumblewag. There's more and more of these coming out too. There's like the Innkeeper's Talent and stuff like that as well. Like we're going to discuss very briefly like a potential +1/+1 counter deck that we've been seeing, and whether or not that's something worth supporting, what kind of cards are making that come together. And Bristly Bill is the type of card that facilitates that deck's existence in our cube. Even if it's a small package of cards rather than a full deck, there is kind of like this secret +1/+1 counter synergy thing going on in the Selesnya space lately. Completely unintentionally. Like, we didn't put Bristly Bill in our cube saying, oh, let's support +1/+1 counters,
I also think it, like, low-key fits into the first deck I think we're going to end up talking about, because I think Bristly Bill is exceptional in that deck. And so when we get there, I think we'll also mention it. It's not for the +1/+1 counter synergies there, just it's a very, very good threat.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we go ahead and transition into talking about some of the decks and what we mean. Do one of you guys want to talk about what we mean when we say emergent archetype?
I was was just gonna say the short of it is I consider these like happy little accidents. They're where we have cards that we've brought in for testing or for other archetypes, and it just happens to be that the intersection of those cards end up creating their own new space that we didn't intend, but it opens up new decks that kind of just incidentally come together. Now, once we're aware of them, they do become a little bit more explicit. Once we become aware of these decks, we are trying to support them because we want to have as many viable decks as possible inside the cube space. But most of the time when these decks come about, it's not necessarily something we were actively trying to do.
Yeah, the first one that we're going to be talking about is literally like a consequence of me coming home one night pretty intoxicated and having Teld sit over my shoulder to make sure that I didn't train wreck myself. And because, I was acting really goofy and he was like, well, it's not my deck, so let's just get wild with it or whatever. We ended up drafting something super fun and really strong that we support now. So, that'll be an example of sometimes when you'll do it yourself. But a lot of emergent design just comes down to when you do a cube, at least I'm like this, right? When I'm designing a cube or really working on anything, I have this really specific idea in my mind of I want there to be possible or available or whatever. But your drafters who didn't create your cube, they're just looking at cards. They're looking at cards. They have their own ideas. Their creativity might be, different than yours, and you just see them put these cards together in a deck that you would never in a million years have even considered doing that. Not because you think it's bad, but because you literally never even thought about it. And it's oh, look at that. That works. That's pretty cool. It's not something I ever would have thought to do. And then the second sort of, in my mind, phase of emergent design is what Teld just mentioned earlier. Is once you realize it's there, if it's cool that it's there and it's fun that it's there, then you can kind of start giving it a little bit more of a nudge into being a more explicitly supported thing.
These decks, they kind of have to be repeatable for you to really give them the attention that we would give them, right? Because every now and then you'll get a drafter who comes in and does something completely wild and builds a deck that kind of works, but in one, you would never recreate that in your own drafts, or the things would have to fall in your lap in a very specific order. So this is something that I try to do personally is break open new decks and stuff. I've drafted Teamer Adventures in the Peasant Cube, which is not an intended archetype. Last time I drafted, I messed around with blue-green beatdown, which is kind of part of the first archetype we're going to talk about. Things of that nature, decks that only come together because of certain size of a cube or certain number of drafters led to wheel in certain cards more consistently, and that's just not going to be something you can replicate. The decks we're going to talk about today are things that we've noticed, things that we've played, things that we've seen other people play that you yourself could actually sit down and draft towards given what's in the cube. Instead of train wrecking yourself trying to find some super niche deck that's not really a supported thing. And Emergent, I just wanted to make a note too that Emergent comes by accident too, right? You can seed specific archetypes and strategies into your cube, right? We've done this before in the past. We don't really take this approach to deck building and cube building very much anymore, but we've seeded things let's try to have a red-white equipment deck and play some red-white gold cards to support it and stuff like that. Or let's have a blue-black ninja deck with a couple blue-black ninja payoffs. That's not an emergent archetype. That's just you putting archetypes in your cube. And that doesn't really work out for us very well because usually you have to do a lot of work to make those archetypes come together in a draft. And you're putting in work for that sort of stuff while everybody else is just kind of drafting generically good cards and having generically good decks. So we don't really take that approach, but that's not really emergent either. So it's not the type of stuff we're going to talk about today. And speaking of, let's go ahead and talk about some decks. So the first one, I'll let you guys handle this because this is a full disclosure. This is a Teld and Chris deck through and through. You guys have talked about it quite a bit. I don't know if other people in our community have attempted to recreate this deck, but you guys seem really high on it, and it is quite effective. So I'll toss this one to you guys. Because you guys talk this up quite a bit. Have you seen anybody else in the community, approach this deck or talk about it or try to, replicate, what you guys see in the deck?
I haven't. I think some people have some misconceptions, I think, about what blue-green is supposed to be doing inside of Magic at the moment. And I actually blame most of this on Uro, if I'm being totally honest. I think people see Uro in our blue-green section and are just okay, blue-green must be doing big rampy things. And I think Uro is just there as a good card. I do think blue-green as a archetype, I do think this is the best version of blue-green. I don't think the like trying to play a low interaction, big ramp deck. I think Uro is more of like a gold. You could classify that as a 5-color card. It would be more accurate. I think like when you actually play blue-green in this cube, you want to be doing this sort of tempo shell because I think that's what our blue cards are providing to the green cards. So basically what this deck is, and we call it Bant Cocaine is the name we've come up for, but it doesn't, I will say it doesn't have to explicitly be Bant. I don't think that's just the version we've drafted. But basically it revolves around a few design decisions that we made. Like we tested out Repulsive Mutation.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like the linchpin card that it's like, okay, this is something
really
legitimately.
It's actually really funny with Repulsive Mutation because I was like, I don't know if you guys remember when we reviewed this, I was like, I think this is a really cool print. If like this kind of blue-green archetype is like ever going to be viable, like in a cube like ours, like this is the kind of print that I want to see. And then we came back and tried it out on the back of, you said it performed really, really well in Peasant. And here it is being one of my favorite cards in our whole mainline cube. So, sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so I think the Repulsive Mutation kind of headlines the deck where it's just like, if you played MKM, you know that if you get ahead and your opponent had Repulsive Mutation, you do just lose the game. Okay, so I think one of the advantages of this deck, like just kind of getting into it, is it's a blue-green tempo deck. And one of those advantages, I think, is that you get around the problem that green decks frequently have of getting into green without dorks. Like, you can draft the good green threats, you know, your Vorinclexes, or your Bristly Bills, or your Sharp-Eyed Recruit, or Bloated Contaminator, or whatever. You can draft these threats without having the dorks, because your game plan is not ramp into dork. It is stick a threat, and then I'm going to ride these threats across the finish line. So you're looking more for protection spells and removal spells, which is why you do have to go into a third color. I don't think just straight blue-green is something you want to be doing because you still limit yourself in terms of removal, even though green's removal has gotten better. A lot of your creatures are going to be very small. You're looking for the dorky flyers and things to pump them. You're looking for Tyvar Stand, slip out the back, and things like that. So all of that said, you know, I do think me and Chris are the only people who have played and drafted this deck. Other people are either, I don't think, aware of it or don't, you know, necessarily believe in it, but we have tested it across a number of matchups and it's performed really well across a number of, you know, different shells. I think the biggest things going against this deck are the general assumption that if you're in green, you should be ramping, which I think the prevalence of green-white lately is going to push people away from that. Like, you can play green-white or green-based aggressive decks. And then I think a few of the cards, like if you start drafting blue cards, I don't think you look at green cards as a general tendency of our drafters. You just kind of gloss over them because you're looking for pairing them with other cards that make more sense in the sort of general way Magic is played. But you do get to take advantage of the fact that you get cheap blue flyers, evasive blue threats, snowbally blue threats, and you get the very, very powerful blue spells, as well as green's threats and protection. I think all of that adds up to make a deck that is like actually a pretty good aggressive tempo deck. You splash a third color to get removal, so we usually see it in white, so you get cards like Get Lost or Ossification, things like that. And usually you want to have like something really, really powerful to do, like Repulsive Mutation or Time Warp or something. And like after you get to like 3 or 4 mana, you're just like kind of playing cheap interaction and flash threats are like kind of the name of the game. And I think the deck does suffer from, one, it needs good mana. Like you have to have good mana to play this deck. And green kind of has to be open, but you also aren't prioritizing green threats. And you have to get the blue creatures, which was not a big deal, but I do think is becoming increasingly contested to get the blue threats that you're looking for in this deck, given that people have picked up on the fact that those 2 and 3 mana blue cards, like cheap creatures and things like that, are quite good.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, like, it also depends, right? Like, I've seen you play versions of this that are a lot more green than any of the versions that I've played. The first version of it that I ever drafted, it was kind of like a blue-white aggro control deck, and it was like, oh, Tyvar Stand and Repulsive Mutation and the Goose Mother are all really powerful cards in this. Like, my version was like a Spell Queller deck, right? And then, like, Bristly Bill, you know, like, it's like the kind of deck where you'd have like a Questing Beast and a Snapcaster Mage in the same deck, which is fun. You know, you get like with white, you get Lost and Reprieve. So I think like the easiest way for me to summarize like why green adds something to this deck is like, you know, green has a lot of snowbally, really high value for mana value spent type creatures, especially like lower towards the curve these days. And turns out that like protecting the development of powerful green creatures with counter magic is just a way to win games, you know. And as Teld mentioned, like I actually really like that blue green has gone in this direction because blue green's direction in Magic design historically has always been like, well, green ramps and blue draws cards, so I guess we'll just like put explore on every Simic card, and that's an archetype
or set mechanic
or set mechanic explore. But the reality is that like I mean there used to be like very early on in the peasant cube, one of the decks that I would draft would just be big chunky blue creatures and like bounce effects, right? Or green creatures and like bounce effects, right? And so it turns out that like just leveraging blue's ability to disrupt tempo and counter magic with powerful green threats that you can get out early, that there is actual synergy there. Whether there appears to be or not, there is synergy between being able to do a whole lot on the board for 3 mana and then cancel your next play for 2.
Well, one of the advantages is that when you've got these big chunky green threats and you've got these evasive blue threats, the big chunky green threats are so good for the mana you spend that you don't actually need a bunch of counter spells. You just need one well-timed counter spell.
Pierce.
So like you're seeing, if you look through the list, I want to say our decks collectively played like 5 counter spells between the two or three different lists. That it's like you play like 2 counter spells per deck, right? You're not playing like 5 counter spells because you only need to extend the game for a couple of turns to kill your opponent.
Yeah, 2 cards I wanted to shout out that fit in this space. And the last time I played the mainline cube, I drafted blue-green. I didn't really think of it as like, oh, this is Bant cocaine or anything, but like it was really blue-green beatdown with some control elements to it. Kind of playing into the late game. I wasn't trying to kill super quick, but 2 cards that really stood out were, first off, Dream Dew Entrancer. That's the blue-green frog that like the 3/4 for 4 that comes down, taps down a creature, puts 2 stun counters on it. Just a great way to leverage that early tempo, stop your opponent's blocker or stop their aggression, and just smash face. That card's great. Obviously a Simic card, so fits right in. And then another one, which I'm just really fond of this card in general, Kitsa Otterball Elite from Bloomburrow. That's the 1 in a blue, 1/3 prowess. Vigilance, looter, does like 15 other things. You can pay 2 mana and tap it to copy an instant or sorcery, but only if its power is 3 or greater. One of the ways I won with that deck consistently throughout the night was to just get really, really into the late game, maybe get into a stalled board state, and then use Primal Might for like X equals 6 or 7, and then copy it with Kitsa to Primal Might 2 things and give like 2 creatures +7/+7 and kill them. Like my opponents went from like 20 to 0 on like turn 16 or something like that, which kind of fits in here. And like some of the key elements to that deck were things like Spell Pierce, just to be able to go like, here's Dream Dew Entrancer and I'm going to Spell Pierce your next play. And suddenly if you were ahead, I'm the person in control now and I'm going to start beating you down. Slip Out the Back is also a nice addition to this deck. Slip Out the Back is the blue instants, phase a creature out and put a +1/+1 counter on it. That card is actually just surprisingly good in a lot of different situations, but being able to, save your 4-drop from your opponent's removal spell or, phase out an opponent's creature for a single mana to get that like big swing in, I found that played out very well. So again, is this a deck you would say, hey, try it out? Or do you think this only comes together like once in a while?
I don't think this is a draft in, draft out deck, but it's not because I think that the blue-green stuff doesn't work. It's because I think the deck does want to splash a 3rd color to be able to get the removal and interaction and stuff it needs. And so I think the getting good enough mana to consistently play it is a little bit of a challenge in some drafts. But I do think it's a deck that if you aren't aware of it and you don't know to draft it in the cube, I think you're leaving wins on the table, because I do think when it comes together, it's quite powerful, especially when our cube goes through the more like everybody's playing these big, dumb, go bigger than you mid-range decks and like aristocrat style decks. Because I think the blue-green tempo deck is really good at beating up on those, because it's good against the big mid-range decks because you've got a couple of counter spells and early pressure to keep them from resolving their big dumb thing. And it's good against aristocrats because you're not really trying to interact with them. All your creatures just either trample or fly. And so you just kind of bypass unless they have the full Voltron combo of like what their deck is trying to do by like blocking your 4/4 or something.
I think it's available to draft more often than people think that it is. It's just the reality is people don't play like our blue-white aggro control deck very much. And it's not because it's not supported and it's not there. It's just at this stage, like a lot of our drafters like have really, really strong preferences. Like I don't have to watch Doug draft. When it's time for me to play him, generally speaking, I'm assuming that he's green. He likes Naya Spectrum stuff. He likes tokens. It's not going to be like too pushed on the synergy. It's just going to be like the cards that are, in his opinion, the best. And it's probably going to contain like green and white. Sometimes it'll be like kind of a blinky value pile. Sometimes it's just going to be sort of Naya stuff, right? Persian is almost always going to draft like a high card quality kind of like multicolor thing with hyper aggressive mana. So I think it's more that the deck itself isn't a whole lot of our regular drafters like style, that it doesn't show up more often. I think that it's pretty straightforward to draft if you're thinking about doing it, you know.
So for a first time Jank diver drafter, it'd be like you wouldn't expect them to draft it unless you explicitly mentioned that it was like a thing that you could do.
No.
Yeah, I think this is an easy deck to train wreck with, which is probably why people don't want to draft it, because you do have to like. There's a very fine line of like where you draft your mana, where you draft your threats, how much flash and interaction, because you want to have like flash creatures as well so that you can pair it with your counter spells and your protection and stuff. So it's not, you know, you want to be constantly playing the shell game, but you also need like the good sorcery speed threats because that's where you get most of your aggressive value. There's a lot of moving parts in this deck, even if I think the deck itself is... I think I agree with Chris that it's frequently available, but like you kind of have to be looking out for it. And I would say if you're not looking to draft it, I think you have to like, I think a lot of our drafters would be like, I don't see the in on it, right? And I think it's recognizing like when you're drafting blue or green or maybe white, like one of those three colors, and like the other two are kind of open, or you're drafting green and blue is kind of open, you're drafting blue and green is open, that sort of thing. I think its biggest advantage is like if you're playing blue and you get the green threats like Bristly Bill and Bloated Contaminator and stuff that while other people are taking the mana dorks and the big threats. I think that's the biggest lane to get in on it. So it'd be something like take a, first pick Bristly Bill or Cryptic Code or something, and then you get like you get the other one or something, and you're just drafting like blue and green cards that aren't mana dorks and aren't counter spells for a lot of the draft. I think that's like one of the easier ways probably to end up in it incidentally.
Chris, do you want to talk about this red-black deck?
Oh, yeah. Like, very, very early in the Cube's development. I mean, we're talking about, like, over 4 years ago now, I think. Not only have we gotten 4 years of increasingly crazy power-crept sets be printed, but there's also been a bunch of, like, backlogging of cards that already existed. The Arena card pools does not even, like, slightly resemble its old self, just in terms of, like, what was available. So, basically, colors kind of had what they had, if that makes any sense, in terms of like the cards that were actually like reasonably good quality. Colors just kind of had what they had. Black red was just sort of a aggro smash type deal, and that's been pretty much the only thing that you could build in like the black red space. But there were cards that, and it's funny because we have a lot of these cards now, and I don't think that they're good enough for us to play anymore. But like I remember when I first kind of got interested in Magic, like I thought that Goblin Dark Dwellers was a really cool card. And I was like, oh man, like playing this and like getting your Doom, like controlling like the game early with like removal, and then like playing this 4/4 menace creature that like Doom Blade's another thing, like that really appeals to me, like the idea of red-black control kind of. And then at one point they printed Prosper in paper, but it wasn't on Arena yet. And I like hit Tim up and I was like, dude, look how cool this card is, This is exactly like the type of card that I would want to see for I wasn't calling it a rock deck yet, because in my mind I was like obsessed with like rock has to be a Golgari or whatever. Sorry, what were you gonna say, Tim?
I was gonna say, what's funny is we mentioned the 30th episode of the deep dive being a deep dive on Rakdos. One of the things we mentioned that I recall in that episode was Rakdos cards we would like to get on the client, and I'm really? Pretty sure Prosper was one of the cards that we mentioned as like, because that was like right when AFR came out, and it was like, oh, I think you messaged me, you're like, look at this cool card, Prosper, and I was like, dude, that's Commander deck card, we don't get that on Arena. So
right, yeah,
but we do have it now.
We do have it now, and it is one of the better cards in the deck that I'm describing. But this was Emergent insofar as, like, it's not a particularly complicated deck. It's not like we actually invented anything here. But, like, I kept thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool if this deck was draftable? And then all of a sudden, like, Theo just started beating me with it all the time. Like, he was the first person, and we started supporting it more after that. He was the first person to just kind of, like, recognize, you know, like, City Stalker Connoisseur is a fucked up card, so I'm just going to put that in every deck that I draft, and just as many Doomblades and Lightning Strikes as possible. And this was before we had, like, Inferno or Grave Titan, which are obviously both insane cards. So, like, Red Black Rock, you know, just, like, interaction stuff that'll kill your opponent, really like board control deck kind of a situation. We've also gotten Aquazats for this deck now, which I feel like I bring that card up enough that I should read it. So for those of you that don't know, Aquazats is a 5-drop 4/4 flying lifelink. Whenever it attacks, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, you draw a card. Whenever an opponent discards a land card, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying, and then when this dies, it turns into a tapped land that can be turned back into this for like 3 mana. The art is so sweet. When we initially reviewed this card, I was like, man, because like I really wanted the 5-drop Shieldred that they printed during the whole Phyrexia whatever run of things. I really wanted just like that to be a really good black 5-drop, and it kind of wasn't. Doom Whisperers, just kind of like this giant dorky chunky thing. You know, so I've been like looking for this like premier black 5-drop, like mid, like really like a signpost for this kind of deck almost. And I was like, man, I really feel like you needed to have multiple opponents for this to be effective, and that's why it's worded this way, which is a thing I have an obsession with thinking. And maybe it just really needs that 5th point of toughness to get there or whatever. It doesn't. If you're playing black 5-drops in your cube, you should try this one because it's really good. But yeah, this basically just this deck eventually just kind of came into being because a player just kind of recognized while they were drafting, like, hey, here's a bunch of like 4-drop and like 1 or 2 5-drop good mid-range threats, and then the rest of my deck is going to be, you know, Thoughtseize and Fatal Push. Yeah, and it works. There's nothing complicated about it. It's just one of our better decks, I think.
So the thing about that like little history in our early stages of the, you know, drafting on this channel is like maybe this is hyperbolic, maybe it's not. Theo to us was kind of like the Sam Black to the Magic community. You know how Sam Black just like drafts these really shitty archetypes in normal retail limited sets and like 3-0s constantly, and then everybody's like, oh, Sam Black did this thing and created this archetype, so I want to do it too, and then like they just don't pilot the deck well. Like that's the sort of thing Theo was doing. Like I'm pretty sure Theo could have played a deck with 39 basics and a Spirited Companion and like beat people pretty consistently, like at least get a 2-1 most nights. So like, you know, because Theo was doing this was not really like a good reason to be doing the same thing. But like the red black rock deck, like I mean, do we even need to explain what rock is? Do people use that terminology? That's just like mid-range doing the most efficient thing at every point in the curve, right? Isn't that what rock generally just kind of means? So like, yeah, you're trying to Thoughtseize, you're trying to Lightning Bolt. You don't play cards that are, you know, even remotely inefficient and stuff like that. So like it's very natural for a deck like that to emerge. Like Chris and I this was pre-Teld, but Chris and I never went in saying, oh, what if our red black section was like just like a Jund deck, you know, sans green or whatever. Like that wasn't really a design goal or anything. This was just kind of a natural occurrence because we had spiky players who wanted to play the most efficient, powerful cards at every point in the curve, and you know, voila, here is the red black rock deck that won pretty consistently for like a pretty. I think there was like a really long win streak with red black X decks for a while, and you know, this red black deck was not something we were expecting to come together as like a super powerful deck, but it sure was, and you know, Theo played it to pretty good success.
I think most of the time when you see this deck now, it's showing up as Grixis or Jund, which we have gold cards that explicitly support those, and I think they printed more flexible cards that go into those. But the combination of just like Thoughtseize, cheap red removal, and like decent creatures is just it's just a winning combination. I think most of the time when we see straight red black, it's the aggro sac deck these days, though.
Yeah, and this really speaks to red black's versatility, because one of the other emergent decks I mentioned here, and it seems like it got deleted off my notes somewhere, was red black spells, which isn't something that I would say we can do very well these days, because we've cut a lot of the spells payoffs, like Young Pyromancer and Dreadhorde Arcanist and stuff like that. But there was a time in our cube where we were like really hard on red spells for like our blue-red deck, and then you just have good black spells like Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, and stuff like that. So if you combine them together, you get these occasional red-black spells decks that are using Dreadhorde Arcanist to flashback a Thoughtseize instead of flashback a Shock or whatever. I know I had a little bit of a stint where I was drafting the red-black spells deck, but I don't think it's super supported. I would not recommend somebody come into our cube now and try to do that. That was more of a product of its time with, the payoffs like Pyromancer and stuff like that. So this is something that still comes up in Peasant, though, right? We saw a red-black deck. Mm-hmm. I think just the other day, I think we were doing like the Timeless Peasant cube, but like I tuned in and somebody was casting Hearth Elemental in their red-black deck, which is just not something you see very often, but it made sense. Like, you just get black removal spells, Doomblades. Chris mentioned Goblin Dark Dwellers, which that's a deep cut. That's a 5-mana 4/4 menace that flashes back a spell with mana value 3 or less.
Man, when that card came out, I thought it was the sweetest card that it ever, like one of the sweetest cards ever. And it's just
it was really good when it came out.
Power creep on.
Do you remember how we got it on Arena, and then like immediately a couple weeks later they printed that the Adversary in Midnight Hunt that like kind of just outclassed it.
I couldn't remember if it was that or like they printed Adversary and then they gave us Dark Dwellers and it was like
it might have been the other way around.
I can't remember which way it was, but either way it was just like sad because like I wanted that. It was like one of those, the Dark Dwellers card was a card I was really interested in for a really long time, and it's like, can I interest you in a 2/2 haste that can also just
do that.
Just do that.
And sometimes it's 8 mana and flashes back at the second spell. Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, red black spells. I wouldn't be surprised if you just like dropped into most Peasant cubes and there was like a viable red black spells deck. But there's another one Chris wanted to talk about here in the Golgari spectrum, which is really promising because I find Golgari is not only like maybe one of my least favorite color pairs, but just seems to be like overall one of the least exciting color pairs you can be in most cubes. So what do we have going on here?
So Teld kind of renamed this like non-traditional sacrifice packages, which I think actually encompasses it a little bit better. But we got this card from Modern Horizons, White of the Reliquary, which is a black and a green for a 2/2 with Vidge that gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. And then you can tap and sack a creature to search your library for a land card, put it on the battlefield tap, then shuffle. No, wow, yeah, I always forget that it's like any land, so you can go get any utility land or go get your Arena of Glory. But in any case, I kind of got it into my head. We also from Modern Horizons 3, and we didn't try to support this thing that we're going to talk about or whatever just because it's a good card. There's this card called Eldrazi Repurposer, which might seem kind of dorky, but it's 3 mana for a 3/3 that brings in an Eldrazi spawn when it enters and then also when it dies. So it makes sack fodder. You're sacrificing things to make mana, which can trigger Blood Artist. So I put together this kind of like theoretical deck, and it looks like I deleted it, unfortunately, or I'd be able to give you a little bit more details. But basically the idea was like, okay, most like hardcore sacrifice decks in our cube are going to be about 75% black anyway. So, like, white and red are awesome secondary colors for that, for a lot of reasons, not least of which red has Goblin Bombardment right now, which is an insane card, but also just, like, offers burn and some stuff, and then white, provides, like, a lot of bodies. That goes really well with Black Sacrifice, too. But when you have an archetype that's, like, centered, and I firmly believe that this is, like, the best way to create open-endedness in your cube designs, is to have the core of an archetype be solidly in a singular color, and then having strong secondary ties to at least 2 other colors to like really make it open-ended. That's not the only way that you can design, but I think a well-supported archetype is like has strong roots in a single color and has good connections to at least 2 other colors. And so it was like, we've got this white card, we've got this repurposer, right? And I built like a black-green sacrifice deck. And there's actually like some really nice little pieces for it. We're playing this sorcery in green now called
Malevolent Rumble.
Malevolent Rumble, yep. It's 1 and a green, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You put a permanent card from among them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, which is really, really nice with like just go put your Bloodghast in the yard. You basically just drew your Bloodghast for free, or, your Tenacious Underdog or whatever. Put that stuff in the yard. And then it makes a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn creature token, which then can be fed to like a Yawgmoth, or you just sacrifice it to generate the mana and that triggers your Blood Artists or whatever. So another fun combo in this kind of like green-black sacrifice deck is because, and some of you may have already like figured it out because I already mentioned these two cards, because White of the Reliquary lets you sacrifice a creature and go get a land out of your graveyard. You just, every time you sacrifice Bloodghast, it just instantly hits the board again, because by sacking it, you're dumping a land onto the board, which dumps it back onto the board. So every turn you can like get multiple sacrifices out of Bloodghast from like different outlets, and you're just dumping it back onto the board while you're ramping yourself, which is really awesome. And there's some other cards that kind of like from green that work well in these decks. So like Quirion Beastcaller is an example of a card like this. You wouldn't necessarily think Quirion Beastcaller is like, oh man, that's like a really nice addition to like a sacrifice deck, because you do not want to sacrifice this thing. You want it to get big. But the thing about, a black sacrifice deck is you're playing a lot of small shitter creatures. And if you can stick Beastcaller and then, start casting creatures out of your graveyard, casting the cheap creatures that you're drawing, it just becomes a really big aggressive threat. So in any case, it occurred to me over time that I think green can be a secondary color for your sacrifice deck, provided that you are pretty heavily black. And then one of our longtime members, admin, and friend of ours, Melody, drafted a variant of this deck this past week, which went into red, which I think is, if your mana can afford it and you're doing like a green-black sack thing, like adding red is an excellent idea, because you get access to Goblin Bombardment, Slimefoot and Squee, which is an insane card for any sacrificey deck. It can be reanimated and reanimate other things. It makes tokens when it enters and attacks. It's just a perfect card for this type of strategy. So this was just an example of, in terms of emergent design, like getting a new card and then starting to think like, I wonder what other pieces there are that might make this kind of like unconventional thing kind of happen. And it was cool to see, because it was something that like I theory crafted, but just wasn't sure if anybody else would ever care to do. And yeah, somebody took a look, figured it out, and played a good version of the deck. I lost to it.
Can we talk just a brief moment about Valgavoth's Onslaught in that deck and how good that looked?
That's
the new green XX sorcery that manifests X times, and then it manifests Dread X times, and then put X +1/+1 counters on those creatures. I saw Melody flip up a 10/10 White of the Reliquary for 2 mana.
That was nuts.
Well, Valgavoth's Onslaught puts a bunch of stuff in the material too, throws the Bloodghast in the graveyard, the Valgavoth's Onslaught looked really good there, as like an incidental way to fill up the graveyard while also adding a bunch of power and toughness to the board. And Manifest is really good on cards like White, because it's just 2 mana and you flip it up and it's gigantic. So yeah, that was kind of cool to see.
Yeah, it was cool. The card definitely looked good.
Yeah. What is it? What is Squee? Are we talking about Slimefoot and Squee? Is that?
Yeah, Squeefoot.
Okay.
Oh, and one other thing that should be mentioned is, and I haven't really seen too many people do this, and this is not something I would try at home, kids. It actually also involves a Modern Horizons. What is with these Modern Horizons cards?
Don't doubt the symbol, man.
Even the uncommons. Even the uncommons.
Well, the uncommons are the ones that are like power appropriate enough to stay in our like rare cube, and they're not like breaking it. So there's an uncommon from MH3 that I've actually really, really liked how it's played out. I don't know how you guys have felt about it, but I think it's been really good. Emrakul's Messenger. It's 1 in a blue for 2/1 flyer with Devoid. It is an Eldrazi Fairy Rogue, so it has a whole lot of shit going on. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, you create an Eldrazi spawn 0/1 you can sack to make a colorless mana.
I didn't realize until just now that in addition to all the other things that this card does, it also just has the 2 best creature types, if you care about creature types, in blue beyond Wizards.
Yeah. It's Tentacle Mommy. It's real scary looking.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's not bring this card up with Mop again. I think
that won't come back to bite you in the outro at all.
No. Okay. Tentacle Mommy. God, if you try to paint me as one of those, but whatever, you can go ahead.
Hey, you said it.
I'm too weak. I'm too weak to come find you right now. Anyway, you can get away with whatever you want. But in any case, it's whenever you draw your second card each turn, and Yawgmoth sacrifices creatures to draw cards. So you probably see where this is going. It's very, very easy with Yawgmoth and a 1 piece of sacrifice fodder to get started. to just constantly have something to feed to Yawgmoth, because you're drawing cards and then you're making stuff and then you're, drawing cards and making stuff. And it's a very, very powerful combination. Going into blue in your Aristocrats deck, not really advisable. I think that this is more like cute that somebody found it than something that you're going to actually want to like set yourself up to do. I think Doug actually like splashed blue in his black-white Aristocrats deck just for this card, and it did work.
He did it one night and it worked, and then like he sought out trying to do it again. I don't know that it worked again. This is a pocket of synergy, as they like to say, rather than an emergent archetype. I don't think blue-black sacrifice is really like don't join us and try to force blue-black sacrifice. It's not going to work out.
That being said, I do think a Boron Oculus that we just added in Dustmourne does kind of fit into this as like making fodder for Yawgmoth.
Sure.
In Whirler Rogue, makes 3 bodies for 1 card. I'm just saying. No, you should generally stay in the Mardu spectrum, I think, but blue and green can provide.
Yeah, you should. I think if you're gonna do like quote unquote green black sack, like I think what you really are supposed to be doing is doing like red black sack and then like picking up a couple of green cards that like work in it really well.
Yeah,
right.
I think the biggest thing that I would take away from what we've been talking about with these decks, and we've got another deck or two to talk about, but I think what it would be is like, don't get too dialed in and locked in on what you're drafting so that you put blinders on to possible synergies in other colors, particularly if your mana is good. This is one of the advantages of taking lands, is you get to keep yourself open to these powerful splashes like Emberkul's Messenger in your Yawgmoth deck. And it's not an intuitive card combo that you would be doing, but these pockets of synergy can get you good equity in terms of win rate if you're keeping in mind that they exist.
Yeah, you mentioned we have a couple more to talk about. The last one that I had written down here is kind of less of an emergent archetype and more of just like a story, as old as Magic itself at this point, because green-white +1/+1 counters is kind of like, they always do blue-red spells. They always do green-white counters, which maybe that didn't start until they like really, really hammered it home in that one core set with like the green-white centaur that doubled counters and stuff like that. But it feels like green-white is always +1/+1 counters these days. For the purposes of our cube, we don't go out of our way to support any +1/+1 counter decks, but like we mentioned with Bristly Bill at the top of the episode, there's so much of it now that's just generically good on its own that like we're kind of seeing the makings of a +1/+1 counter deck come together with cards like Luminarch Aspirant. Ornery Tumblewag is a big piece of that picture. That's the 3-mana 2/2 saddle mount, whatever, that puts a counter on something at the beginning of combat, and then like it can double counters if it was saddled, something like that. You have marked here Bloated Contaminator as a card that suddenly has like new meaning that it didn't have before because of cards like this. Like Bloated Contaminator is the 3-mana 4/4 trample infect, toxic, something like that. When it hits a player, you proliferate, and that's never really mattered that much for our purposes, but with cards like Bristly Bill and stuff, suddenly proliferate's like a good mechanic to have in your green beatdown deck. In fact, that can spiral out of control so much that like you can just kill somebody on like turn 4 or 5 if you get the right setup with cards like Bristly Bill and stuff. But there's enough of this to the point where, just like the Bant cocaine deck, we're like, are there incidental cards that are in the backlog of Magic that we're not playing or haven't played before that could support this without like trying to make it such a parasitic theme? And that's something that I've been looking into. Like a card I suggested recently was the 6-mana Vorinclex from Kaldheim, the one that is basically a double in season for your +1 counters and like halves the number of counters your opponent's permanents get. That's the type of card that like we decided to pass on it. We're not actually going to play it. But if you saw this green-white space as something that emerged in your cube and you were like, oh, you know what, I kind of want to support that a little bit more without making it a super parasitic thing, a card like Vorinclex is just kind of a generically strong card on its own without the synergy that you could include it, bolster this +1/+1 counter deck, and not really like sacrifice the cube slot for a card like Vorinclex, because that card is just a 6/6 haste trampler for 6, So we're not going to backlog. We're not going to shape up our green-white section to be +1/+1 counters or anything like that. But it is kind of nice to see that little pocket come together with cards like Bloated Contaminator, Tumblewag, stuff like that. Innkeeper's Talent, could honestly easily be in our cube as well. Fight rigging is another one that kind of does a similar thing, like get a +1. These effects that are just like get a +1/+1 counter every turn, like they usually play out really well. There's a reason Luminarch Aspirant is still in our cube despite being printed in like 2019 or whatever.
Yeah, still arguably White's best 2-drop as well.
Yeah, it is really funny that the bloated contaminator thing that you mentioned is really funny because it found its way into the cube because it's a 3-mana 4/4 trampler, which was stronger as a baseline at the time than it is now, but that's still obviously a whole lot of beef for 3 mana. And the joke was always oh, the proliferate, when the poison counters that it gives you, it kills you at the exact same speed as the damage from the creature. Haha, isn't this dorky? But yeah, now it actually matters.
Yeah, the number of times I've heard recently it feels like I've heard several times people say, oh, well, I can't actually let this contaminator hit me or I'm gonna die.
Right, so I'm gonna make this terrible, terrible trade that I don't want to make because otherwise, yeah, it's pretty wild. So it's definitely not one of those things because +1/+1 counters is just not. It's not an interesting archetype, right? It's not that it's not fun to put +1/+1 counters and stuff and kill people, but it's not oh man, here's this big brain thing that we're doing. Mm-hmm. So I don't even think like you said, I wouldn't put any cards in here that are not good in a vacuum, but support +1/+1 counter stuff. It's just as these emergent design things start to come up, I think is what you were getting at is you look at a card, that might be kind of borderline versus another card, but it interacts with this thing that's going on now more than it used to.
I think the clear example of this currently we're testing is Reluctant Role Model, the Paul in the Hall. I don't think we would have. I don't think without the line of text about +1 counters or the counters on creatures that we would have ended up including this card. It's just kind of a snowbally threat on 2. But the fact that it does interact favorably with all of these counter cards, and it's just sort of an aura for those sort of things, makes it, now it's a snowbally 2-drop that also has a synergy piece with some other things you might be playing.
Yeah, the opposite of that would be something like Hardened Scales, right? Where we're oh, people are putting together these little packages of +1/+1 counters in their decks. What if we try to support that with a card like Hardened Scales? Well, Hardened Scales is taking the cube equity slot of something probably better. Hardened Scales not that good of a card, but also now you've added a card to your deck or to your cube that only goes in one deck, right? You've added it. You've made your cube marginally more parasitic by adding a hyper specific payoff to this emergent deck that may or may not come together every time. So that's what you don't want to do. Whereas a card like Reluctant Role Model, that card, yes, it's very good with the +1/+1 counter stuff, but you could just play that in your red white aggro deck. It's a good 2-drop, it's not parasitic. It goes in a lot of other decks as well.
Yeah, I think as long as you're aggressive and acknowledge that if you're not in the counter space, it's going to be bad late game. It's just a good 2-drop. You play it on 2, find a way to get it through, it gets flying, and now it can start stacking up.
Yeah, and in fact, as a parallel to this, we used to run our Peasant green-white section as +1/+1 counters for years, pretty much ever since we got that Centaur from M21 or whatever, but we no longer do that. Our green-white section is more token-based because we found green-white +1/+1 counters was such a glass cannon deck that if your opponent just never interacted with you, you would run them over, but if they ever had a piece of interaction for your payoff, your deck just kind of crumbled. So it's not even the type of deck that I would want to go out of my way to over support because it falls apart to interaction and stuff like that. So it does kind of exist in our current iteration. This is probably the newest example of a emergent deck because Bristly Bill, Tumble Wag, cards like that are all prints within this year, within the last couple months actually. So it's something we're going to keep an eye on to see if we get more stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if we start getting cards like Luminarch Aspirant in every set. It feels like they're just pumping those cards out, and then you have your Kyrian Beast Callers, and even a card like what's the rookie, Sharp-Eyed Rookie, a 2-drop that picks up +1/+1 counter is perfectly fine on its own, but has the text +1/+1 counter. So your Tumblewag interacts with it, your Bristly Bill interacts with it, so on and so forth.
One card I do want to shout out here, because historically our green-white section was more of a go-wide token stack, and I still think that's kind of the synergies that we've been focusing on. But I wanted to shout out Sandstorm Salvager from the OTJ bonus sheet. That's
the big score.
Yeah, it's the green Blade Splicer. So it's 2 and a green, and it's a 1/1, makes a 3/3 golem when it enters play, and you can pay 2 and tap it to put a +1 counter on each creature token you control, and they gain trample. So this is a way of, if you've got a bunch of like random token makers, which exist in green and white, to be able to get some counters on them, so that if you've got an Ornery Tumblewag or a Bristly Bill or a Contaminator, you can start pumping them up as well. So it kind of acts as a glue card between these two sort of deck types.
Yeah, the tokens and +1/+1 counters tend to play quite well together, both in the Selesnya space as well. So the only thing I really wanted to add here beyond the actual decks that we've seen crop up in our cube is the existence of 3-color cards and how that can like signal a theme to your drafters. There's 2 ways to go about this, right? You can either play a 3-color card in order to tell your drafters, hey, I want this deck to exist in this 3-color space. Go ahead and draft it, and here's your incentive to do that. That's less emergent and more like you just want to kind of push people into a direction you think is already there. But you can also like use the 3-color cards to accent some of the stuff that you've seen. So I think an example of this, of a card that didn't really pan out for us, we didn't play for very long, was the March of the Machine Narset, the Aftermath Narset. I don't remember the name of the card, but it was basically like a 4-mana 3/4 that gave all your creatures prowess, and you could cast a spell from a graveyard when it attacked. Something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And that was less like, oh, we want there to be a Jeskai spells deck, and more that we recognized people were, fiddling around with young pyromancers and Monastery Mentor and cantrips in the same deck. What kind of 3-color support might there be to kind of signal that deck is there already? And that Narset didn't really like see too much play. It wasn't super popular with people, but that came about because we saw Jeskai spells coming together on occasion. Another example of that being something like Glarb, from Bloomburrow. Glarb Calamity's Augur is a Sultai card that does a bunch of graveyard stuff. Perfectly fine card on its own, but kind of signals like, hey, there's graveyard stuff going on in Sultai, like, hey, drafters, do you want to try out graveyard stuff? Because here's a 3-color card that can do it. Rafine, maybe Chris can speak to Rafine more, because I'm still really like not a believer in this card, but I know Chris has been kind of a champion of like the secret blue-black kind of like tempo beatdown decks, tempo aggro decks, and stuff like that.
I just think people like the card. I don't think Rafine's presence is like an indicator of anything really. Like it's not pointing towards like a particular deck existing. I just think it's like a very like tempo proactive kind of mid-range threat. You just play like Esper proactive mid-range stuff. I think it just goes well in your deck.
That's fair.
It's definitely not. I did not want to put it in there because I was like, oh, this is gonna like Rafine's presence is gonna show people that there's like this secret deck that they can unlock. I think people just like putting Rafine in their deck.
I was going to ask you guys, with these gold cards, these 3-color gold cards, what would one that you would want to see look like? Because I think we have room for like one in the color sections, if at most. So one that I obviously want to see is a Bant card that would be like an evasive tempo creature. And I don't know exactly what that would look like, but that is one that I would want to see. Well, I was kind of disappointed in Bloomburrow. The Bant card they seeded was just this like weird mana dork thing.
Yeah,
it was like I'm really hoping we see, and I don't want something this power level, but in the, dare I say it, design space of Nadu, but like not that broken. Like a balanced version of Nadu that
you spoke the forbidden word.
Yeah. But like just something with evasion and could like support, our tempo deck that way we could have a card that like brings the room together and signals that it exists.
We also secretly got Derevi from Bloomburrow, which I don't think is quite there on power level for the mainline cube, but it kind of fits that space you're talking about. That's the 4-mana Bant 2/3 flying bird that like taps or untaps a permanent when it enters, and then whenever a creature you control deals damage to an opponent, you can tap or untap a permanent. So like it's got this kind of mana doubling potential, usually locks down a creature or taps down a blocker the turn it comes in. It has like extraneous commander text on it. It's an old commander card, Derevi Imperial Tactician. It's got a line of text that's like completely useless outside of commander. I think, and maybe like a pumped up version of that is what you're talking about for the Bant space.
Yeah, I mean, I think more like along the lines of, I think what I would want is something on the lines of like Kel and the Kid, except with like text that actually matters. Because like, just like decently statted flying evasive creature, maybe gains you some life and has like some sort of relevant text. That's the sort of space that I'm thinking, but it seems like Bant these days is just like blinky ETB stuff that they want to support, or like random synergy that is not synergistic with anything else, I guess. I just kind of was glancing through like the Bant cards on Arena, and they're just none of them.
Arcades the strategist.
Yeah,
defenders.
Exactly. Like, what is this doing?
Yeah, they're just like big Bant value ramp stuff.
And
the reality is that like those kinds of cards, you typically just end up seeing them in like 4-color, like Omnath green. You know, it's not really like a Bant thing so much. I don't really for me. I mean, I think what we're talking about right now is a little off of the emergent design idea. But if there was like if I could just like invent, or not invent because I'm not actually a good card creator, but like have them create something of like an appropriate power level that does cool things, that like facilitates a 3-color overlap into like one like monocolor rooted archetype. I would love to see like a Mardu sacrifice card that's actually worth like stretching your mana to play.
Butcher the Horde.
Offspring's
Revenge.
It's
like Offspring. Yeah, I mean, like don't get me wrong. There are many like possible candidates that exist. It's just that there really just hasn't been one worth playing. We were trying to make the Strixhaven guy who's supposed to be like Voldemort or whatever.
Like
we're trying to make that. Yeah, we were trying to make that work for a while, and it kind of didn't make any sense. So, I mean, it won't break my heart if we never get this card, but it's like Mardu Sac Spectrum stuff is just such like an ancient and obvious like color archetype kind of crossover space in Magic, and just having like one good Mardu sacrifice card, you know, to kind of be the crown jewel of the whole archetype or whatever, and really signal to drafters that going 3-color can offer you some strong
maybe if they do the right thing when we go back to cons next year and like revert to 3-color stuff, you know, instead of 2-color stuff, might see some Mardu stuff there.
Get a new push Zergo.
Yeah, or like an actual 2024 Butcher of the Horde instead of a 2014 Butcher of the Horde. Just give it Ward 3, then we'll play it. Final kind of closing thought, something actionable here that I wanted to close out with is to cube designers. Like, do yourself a favor and like tinker around with your color pairs when you're drafting, assuming there's like nothing on the line and you're just like drafting your cube as you normally would. Especially if you're someone who gets a lot of reps in like we do, like tinker around with things, like mix and match archetypes, see what can come up, you know, encourage your drafters to try and do creative stuff. You will get drafters who just want to do the best thing every single time, and that's fine, but you also get people who like actively seek out nonsense decks and stuff like that, and a lot of it doesn't pan out, but every now and then you will see something pop up. So my goal when I do get to join is to try and do something different or do something new. Like, I don't necessarily care about spiking the cube. If there's nothing at stake, I don't care. So, like, I will draft blue-green Kitza beatdown decks or mono-blue, you know, Yorion Blink decks, which is a thing of the past at this point. So, just to tinker around and see what material's there, what comes together. And I recommend other people do that as well. If there's nothing on the line, don't go drafting like mono blue Yorion if like you actually paid into a cube draft.
Don't pull this at CubeCon. Go spike.
Yes.
But yeah, no, like I think I agree. I usually am trying and figure something interesting out when I draft. I don't always get to do that, but I do like it when I'm able to put together interesting things. Like I've drafted, you know, in the past, like Boros mid-range before that, when everybody was just playing aggro and like 4-color control and stuff like that. And before I got the sort of cocaine deck to work, I failed drafting. I'd like train wrecked blue-green 2 or 3 times trying to figure out what that deck was supposed to look like. Because you could, as the designers, like I guess like we were playing and, you know, I kept seeing something there. I knew there was potential there, but sometimes you've got to be able to iterate on it. And I think that's where we get an advantage of being able to draft 1 to 2 times a week of our cube, is I can do that and it doesn't ruin my night, right? Like I got to, you know, if I drafted the cube once a month and I train wrecked 2 or 3 months in a row trying to get this deck to work, I would feel really silly. But you know, if I train wreck on a Wednesday evening trying to make this deck work, that's a little bit of a different story.
Yeah, if you have difficult to draft decks in your cube and it's like a not every draft it's available kind of a thing, and you only draft like 4 times a year, then like yeah, you might not even see the deck click ever again.
Oh, it's especially if you're not opening like your whole sealed pool. You're playing like a 540 or something.
Right.
Like that.
Which, not to get on a soapbox, but this is one of the big reasons that I'm an advocate for. Like, if you only get to cube like 3 or 4 times a year, and you have like 6 people in your play group, like you don't need to maintain a 540 card cube. You're already not seeing the cards very often. Mm-hmm. But that's obviously a whole separate topic.
Yeah, which we'll get into a different time. We've
already gotten into that. Yeah.
Multiple times, I'm sure. Okay, well, with that, let's go ahead and close out this episode. Remember, as always, you can find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, and hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, let us know what you like, don't like, or what you want to see in the future. If you have Emergent Archetypes in your cube, let us know about those as well. And you can find Teld streaming on twitch.tv/Teld Talks. Where are you still on the Fire Emblem hype, or is this Morrowind now, or what are we streaming?
I'm not sure of Morrowind, but I did finish part 1 of my Vision Quest Iron Man, so I got through the part with 3 units dead, so 1 part down, 3 to go.
Is that relatively good or bad?
I'm not playing on the hardest difficulty, and the units I let die were kind of dumb. I don't know. It's been fun. I don't claim to be good at Fire Emblem. I'm doing it because it was enjoyable to do. But,
Sure. I was just like, with zero context, I was imagining like a military troop where the general comes back and he's like, "We got through with only 3 people dead. We're good." Like, I don't know what that means.
You get quite a number of characters, so I mean, like 3 dead, I guess is okay. I managed to get both of my early game archers killed, which was a bit of a pain for a couple of the mid game chapters where you would like to have an archer. I know you don't have any context there, but if you play Fire Emblem,
I could have some context if I ever dropped by on twitch.tv/Teld Talks, which you too, listener, can. We'll have a couple more episodes before we get. I think Foundations comes out in November, so we've actually got a reasonable amount of time before another set review. Thank God, because I need a moment. It was a lot to get through the 2 review episodes, but yeah. If you're listening on YouTube, leave that like, and we will talk to you all next time. How much would you guys care if I just ranted a little bit for the farewell, for the sign off here?
That's okay with me, man.
Okay. So, and this isn't like me trying to be funny rant. This is like an actual like soapbox thing that has been bothering the shit out of me in the Magic community lately. Partially, mostly in like paper, like in-person Magic, but also I've seen some of this trickle down into a few members of our community, and I just want to address it because it bothers the shit out of me. But I went to a Duskmorn pre-release, last weekend, the weekend before, and I went to 2 separate pre-releases and played against a total of 8 opponents throughout those 2 nights. And of those 8 opponents, I would say 2. I would say 2 were generally like pleasant to play against, and the other 6 were either completely unpleasant, like really like unpleasant to play against, or just like had attitudes or whatever. I had one guy who played against me who constantly throughout the entire match kept saying things like, "Oh, you're fucked now, buddy. You're really going to regret this next turn." Like things that you just shouldn't say to another human being, which really just got under my skin. And then I had one opponent who completely trashed me the first night. Like their deck was insane. Double Dollmaker's Crypt or whatever it's called, like Wandering Emperor, like just insane sealed pool. They crushed me. And when they beat me, I was like, "Look, your deck's really good. Like, congratulations. Like, you did great on your sealed pool. You played really well." And they were like, "Thanks." Day 2, I played against that same person, and I crushed them because my sealed pool was really good, and it wasn't even close. Like, I completely annihilated them. And this little whiny baby boy, like, scooped his cards up, gave me a look, reported the match, and just like ran away from the table. Like
ran away, like
not ran away like crying, but like you could tell like the visible frustration that he lost the match, like the scurrying to pick his cards up so he could get away from the table. He never said a word to me either. He never said a word after that. I beat him. I was like, "Thanks for the games." He didn't respond. He picked up his cards and he got out of there as quick as possible. And like that really just kind of like led me to want to say like rant a little bit about the way people have been interacting with their opponents. And this is not new. Like this has just always been a thing with Magic players, but man, people just really need to learn how to take a loss and like it's okay to congratulate your opponent for winning a game. Like, I was made under multiple matches to feel bad for winning my games this pre-release weekend, which is bullshit. Like, I should not win a game and then feel bad because my opponent, like, is upset that they lost a game. And I see this with a couple, like, I'm not going to name names here. I'm not intending to do that, but it is something I wanted to address in our community, specifically with certain players who are regulars, who have this kind of, I guess, inherent, like, belief that either they're supposed to win all matches or, like, something really bad happened if they lost a match. And I played in the Jank Diver Gaming Cube not too long ago with that blue-green deck I was talking about, which I thought was really cool. I thought I drafted well. I thought I played really well. I won a match that went to like 16, 17 turns with this like huge play at the end. And my opponent, instead of like either remaining silent or, you know, congratulating me on doing something really cool, just sat there complaining about how I top decked and how like I got everything I needed that game and how I was so lucky, and like literally like attempting to make me feel bad for winning the game. And I hate that sort of stuff, and I see it coming up a lot where people will take a loss and instead of saying anything positive to their opponent, it's always, oh, you top decked really well, or like, oh, I got so unlucky. Like I like have this like mini mission right now to change the way people engage with like losing a non-competitive tournament where there's nothing at stake. Like at a pre-release, I guess there's something at stake, like a prize pack or whatever. But if you're coming to join our cube, like there's nothing at stake. Like have fun with it. If you lose, you lose. Like it's not that big of a deal. But we've just got these voices that I would like to keep addressing, you know, who are bringing people down for, you know, losing games. I think we lost a member not too long ago, and I don't know if they're a listener or not, but I would hope that if they heard this, they would come back. But we lost a member recently who joined us for maybe the first or second time, and their opponent just like was complaining about their top decks and stuff the entire time they were playing against them, and they basically said like, and then they won the game anyway, which is the worst. When someone's complaining, and then they win. And they were basically like, you know, I didn't feel very good about my match because my opponent just complained the entire time. They weren't encouraged. It wasn't a fun time. We were supposed to be playing a game, and my opponent just seemed upset. So I would like to encourage people to, instead of like griping about why you lost a match, maybe like congratulate your opponent every now and then. Like it's easy when you're playing arena on your own to just like, you know, zone out and be like, they top deck, that's so lucky, blah blah blah. Like, you know how everybody says that stuff when they're sitting in a room by themselves and playing. Like everybody does it. But like if you're talking to other human beings, especially if they can hear you, like just tell them, you know, hey, cool deck, you know, good game, thanks for the games, whatever. You don't have to give them the handshake. I don't want to get into the handshake conversation.
Yeah.
But it really discredits. Sorry, I'll shut up here in 2 seconds.
No, you're good.
What I really hate is to see someone who did really creative deck building or drafted responsibly or drafted very well, and that is diminished by their opponent complaining. Like one of my least favorite things that comes up so much now is when people complain about top decks in our cube. It's a cube full of powerful cards. Every top deck is going to be a powerful card. Like,
oh man, you drew something worth spending 5 mana on.
Yeah,
and you lost. Yeah,
that's the.
Oh
cube.
Man, you put a bullet in your gun and fired it at me.
Oh, you top decked I can't believe you
Well,
top decked a removal spell in your deck with 12 removal spells.
Here's the deal. If you think
Yeah.
you are the biggest brain in the world, and you think you are just better than all of your opponents, and you're a god gamer, go play chess. You'll win 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, I think arguably, like a lot of these people probably shouldn't like go play chess because they might have to have an uncomfortable conversation with themselves.
Right, but like what I'm getting at is you've elected to play a game that inherently has variance in it, and that is part of the fun. And like I get it, I've occasionally been guilty of it. I try to be more analytical of just like, oh, I should have done this, or I could have made this decision, or whatever. I will say one thing that Chris, you know, I'm gonna shout you out here, that a ways back I was just on the worst kind of like losing streak I had been on in a while. The variance just every night was just turning not my way. And I remember I was kind of complaining to Chris in private, just be like, man, I don't know, like I just feel like I'm just losing, like every time, you know, my I just flood out or whatever. And he said something along the lines of like, make sure people have a bad habit of like tying their self-worth to hobbies or something along those lines. I can't remember exactly what you said, but it was really one of those things that made me stop and be like, yeah, am I doing that? Like, I don't intend to do that, but like, am I putting some of my self-worth at my performance in a game that I should enjoy that for fun? And I think it's okay to look at like trying to improve and making, and recognizing like when you had no outs and stuff like that. But also just, it's also okay to tell your opponent they had a good game. Like recently we were playing the Peasant Cube and I was playing this green-black deck that was like kind of decent. I won my first 2 rounds, played for the finals, and the finals was over in a grand total of like 9 turns. Like I got destroyed by a Boros deck that was like, it was just like wombo combo Shadowfax nonsense. And, one of the things that I was actually really proud of myself was that when the game was over, it was like, I can't even be mad. Your deck was sweet. Like, it was like, that was a well-earned trophy.
I would love to hear more of that than like, oh, you drew your sweeper against my creature deck. Like, yeah, your opponent put a sweeper in their deck. That's smart of them. Like, they're supposed to do that, and they get to draw it every now and then. Like, that happens. That's a thing. It happens to you as much as it happens to everyone else. Like,
and don't get me wrong. Like, I understand like why people get salty. Like, sure. I don't like losing. Yeah. If I go 0-3, like by the time I'm like halfway through the second game of my last match, like I kind of don't want to be there anymore. But the fact of the matter is that like if I don't play, then I'm denying another person an opportunity to play a game that maybe they wanted to play. That's thing number one. But like thing number two is like it's a bummer, but. And like it's normal to have that kind of those negative emotional reactions to losing, but like I got news for you guys. Like I'm not good at Magic. I lose all the fucking time. And I'll see somebody who like 3-0'd the week before and they went 1-2 this week and they're just obviously really unhappy about it. It's like, dude, you won last week.
Right.
They're not all going to be great weeks. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad for like being like, god damn, I'm losing a lot tonight. This sucks. It does suck. It's just like you don't have to like get it on everyone else around you. It's not that big of a deal.
It's important to recognize too that sometimes the RNG does go in your favor. Like all those times that you flooded out or whatever, like think about the times where you were playing to like your 1-outer and you drew the 1-outer, That's the other thing is people don't give credit to the fact that like, yeah, you got the lucky top deck, but your opponent played in such a way that they gave themselves the out of that top deck.
And it feels so good when that happens, just to have somebody deflate it by being like, oh, what a lucky top deck. Like you're so lucky. Like that's just such a deflating feeling to come off of that high of like, oh, I hit my 1-outer in 1 in 16 cards or whatever, and I won this game where I was at 1 life, just to have like your opponent be like, oh, well, if I had drawn blah blah blah, I would have won. Like, shut the fuck up. Like, let me have my win. I hate that stuff.
I definitely have been in situations before, well, like more than before, like it happens, where it's like and especially since this is my community, right? Our community, like that kind of changes the calculus for me a little bit. But it's like, I just won the game, which I don't get to enjoy that feeling very often. Like, I just won the game, and I'm in a situation where it kind of feels like you're making me make you feel better about the fact that I just beat you. Yeah. It's like, don't do that. Like, just don't.
It is different when you're playing like a cube where, oh, they put Wormcoil Engine in this cube and I'm playing aggro. Like, yeah, you get tilted by that stuff, right? And obviously in retail limited, when your opponent goes mythic into mythic, it's like, yeah, you are lucky, right? But like, you don't have to berate the person. Like, you can just concede and go to the next game. And when it's in a cube environment, like a lot of those complaints just don't even work. Like the top deck complaint just does not work because everything's powerful. Like, everything should be powerful. So like, yeah, you're going to top deck an answer to their, like, you're going to play against a deck that has 12 removal spells some amount of the time, and they're going to kill your 1-drop, your 2-drop, your 3-drop. It's not like, oh, I can't believe they had removal for every creature I play. It's like, yeah, it's cube. Like, that's how it works. Like, I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to quit ranting there and just say, like, to anybody who finds themselves being like a salty Sally every now and then, like, it's okay. It's okay to be salty about things, but like, you don't need to verbalize it in a way that diminishes like your opponent's wins. Like you can say like, I lost this game, it sucks, like that's a bummer, like everybody says stuff like that, but try to give your opponent like a congratulations, unless you got stuck on one land or whatever, then you can complain all you want.
Well, you kept a one-lander.
Well, yeah, then it's your fault.
Biggest thing I wanted to touch on, like, that I've heard a lot lately is people kind of doing the selling the bluff. And I get it that you're trying to win, but like I've seen numerous people, and I don't know how much of this is like they're guilty of doing this versus it's just their natural behavior, but just kind of the complaining about how bad their luck is and how down they are and how poorly things are going while they're sitting there setting up lethal in their hand.
Yeah, and they win the game. That drives me crazy, is the people who complain the entire time and then win the game. It's like, stop complaining and just like play the game. Focus on the game. Stop complaining about like the individual little elements of the game or whatever.
Yeah, the sort of like mental damage you're trying to do or trying to set up your bluff so that you can win. I just think it's like it's really not good sportsmanship. Even if like if you were playing for a pro tour, sure, go ahead, do that shit all you want.
What do you mean, like set up a bluff? Like trying to influence how seriously your opponent is like going to take their next decision based on the idea that they're like broadcasting that they're going to lose?
More or less, yeah.
Are you talking about like trying to influence the outcome of the game, like by pretending that their hand is worse than it is or something?
Correct. And I don't know how much of this is like people actively doing this, but like we have a lot of people who will sit there. Maybe not a lot, but we have several people at least who will sit there and talk about how bad their draws have been while they're literally holding on to the best possible. Like,
folks, we love you. Thank you for coming out and playing. Like, try to keep it.
Yeah, just be encouraging. Like, just bring an encouraging attitude to a zero stakes tournament is what I'm asking. Like, and I'm not saying like, oh, our community is full of these people, but there are recurrent voices. And then like at the pre-release, I don't play a lot of Paper Magic these days. So like when I went to the pre-release that I haven't been to in a while, it was like, oh yeah, this is how Magic players act, like constantly.
Yeah, this is why Jank Diver Gaming exists.
Yeah,
like
because
I was like, let's collect the 8 people we like and go get shit-faced in a bar and play Magic instead of doing this, and that's why we're here.
And look, I love you. Look, if you're one of our normal players and this doesn't apply to you, like I'm not talking about you. You know, like the people who would listen to this, who are the people I'm talking about, know who they are. They know they do it. We've talked to them about it and stuff like that. It's not a huge part of the community. It's more of like a part of Magic like mentality as a whole. And I wanted to get that off my chest because man, like I felt super like I was rubbed really wrong by that person who like just curb stomped me the first day and then didn't have the gall to like give me a good game or like, oh, congratulations the second day after. Like you could tell they didn't know who I was. They felt entitled to win that match or whatever. And I was like, no, actually, I'm sorry, dude. I'm a good Magic player. Like, you just got a really good seal pull day one. Like, sorry, dude. And just weaseled away. Like, it just really upset me. So anyway, thanks for letting me take the time to rant about that. I didn't know where else this would make sense to talk about. So there you go. And now Yugimoto plays Magic the Gathering. The soul of my grandfather is on the line. I must win this duel at all costs. Now I summon my trump card, the mighty Dark Magician, in attack mode. Dark Magician has 2,500 attack points, and since your life total is only 20, it will end you in one blow. Yeah, man, I'm just gonna go ahead and Doomblade that. What's this? How did this player come into possession of such mighty cards? Dude, I got this out of an M14 booster pack. Look, are you going to your end step yet or not? My opponent is quite formidable, but I must triumph. I set one card face down and end my turn. Alright, untap, upkeep, draw. Sure. Okay, I'm gonna play a Swamp and Thoughtseize you, so I get to discard a card from your hand. No, my Winged Dragon of Ra! But wait, my opponent has fallen for my trap. I activate my trap card, Call of the Haunted. This lets me bring my Winged Dragon of Ra back to the battlefield. Nah, man, I'm gonna pitch a Daze to Force of Will that. How is this possible? My opponent stopped my trap card. I've lost my best cards. I'll need to draw something powerful to stay in the game and save my grandpa. I draw for turn. Wait, dude, I wasn't done with my... draw for turn. Now, I activate the Pot of Greed spell card. Okay, what's that do? The Pot of Greed allows me to draw 2 cards from my deck. So like a 0 mana divination seems broken, but sure, it resolves. This is it. I need to believe in the heart of the cards. My next 2 draws will determine the fate of my grandpa and the world. Heart of the cards, guide me. Oh man, did you see what Yugi just drew? Yeah, it was like a Silver Fang and a Mammoth Graveyard? I told him to stop putting those shitty vanillas in his deck, but he never listens. I'm all out of options. Is this how it ends? Maybe I can bluff my way out of this situation. Nah, man, I've got Kiki Resto in hand. I'll make 1,000 copies and hit you for lethal. Good game, Pharaoh. No, I've lost. My grandfather. The fate of the world. Hey, don't worry, Yugi. It's me, Joey Wheeler. I'll avenge you. To be continued? No, absolutely fucking not. We're not doing that. Oh, Jesus.